Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, nā mi nui a koutou nā rangatira i nā huhuki. The promise of education, the intergenerational gift that we have to ensure that the world we are born into is not necessarily the world we die in, recognises for me that education is centred in hope. Hope sustains a democracy. A simple belief that we have that individually our lives might be better and that the world we enter and the world we leave might be different places and different things. Tonight I suggest this is, or should at least be, a debate about how we protect that gift, that promise, which we as adults are responsible for ensuring every child in this country has that opportunity to receive. My role tonight is to speak about the evidence, about the issues which hinder or get in the way of us realising this promise. Firstly, is the promise still alive? Does education still deliver the hope for a better life and world to our children? Or is there a crisis in education in New Zealand? The evidence says no, there isn't a crisis. And those who would create one for their ideological or political ends need not only to consider the evidence, but to consider their motivation in creating such a crisis. The evidence is clear that New Zealand has a world-class education system, which does a good job for the vast majority of its children. Much of that is because of the quality of our teachers, the strength of our national curriculum, and what I notice all the time when I go into schools, a genuine desire within the teaching profession to deliver a high quality education to all. What this suggests to me is that the evidence clearly indicates there is no justification for radical wholesale changes to education systems. For example, there is no evidence to suggest that further radical changes, including the further privatisation of the state system through charter schools, or as the ACT Party suggests through a voucher system, is necessary. And not only is it not necessary, but of course the international evidence is overwhelming in determining they are of little value anyway. I want to focus though on the three factors we know impact most on whether or not children gain the most from the promise of education, because although we can all say that yes, we're doing a good job for the majority, no one in this room is saying that we're not doing as well as we could. What limits the possibilities? What gets in the way of children doing as well as they could in school? And what we know is that the largest factors which determine how well we do in school is what happens outside the school gate rather than what happens inside them. The single biggest factor is poverty. There are children only 10 kilometres from here who went to school today without anything on their feet, no food in their stomachs, and they came from cold homes. The rain fell about 3 o'clock, and many of them would have realised their walk home would mean the clothes they arrived in at school today would still be wet tomorrow morning. They are looking forward to Duffy school books coming in and giving them a book they can all call their own. You see, the most important indicator of how well you do at school is the number of books you have in a house that you grow up in. The social cultural capital that you arrive at the school gate with is the strongest and clearest indicator of how well you will do. Of course, poverty in New Zealand is not new, and it doesn't define who you are or who you will become. I come from a very poor family. Often there was simply not enough food on the table, and I remember only too well what it meant in winter to have holes in the one pair of shoe you went to school in. I understand from my life that people aren't poor because it's their fault or that they are lazy. My mother was the hardest working woman I ever met. My father, the wisest and the most successful, he died a poor man, but I understand, of course, that wealth and poverty aren't the real markers of achievement in life. My father explained that to me often. Life is not judged, he'd say, by how much money you make, but what you give back to the community in which you live. I know from my own life that poverty need not define us. It didn't define me, and it didn't define many of us in this room, but I also know it and recognise that it limits the life chances we have. My dad used to always put it simply, it's easier to climb the ladder of success if your dad built the ladder. The evidence suggests, therefore, that the group we must concern ourselves with in education are perhaps not those who are not achieving the national standards, it's those who have been left behind in the great economic experiment of neoliberalism. And if they are the one in the same group, then we must address at a wider level why we are creating a country with such unequal wealth, with a few gaining so much at the expense of so many. This is a political question, and at a more fundamental level, it's a deeply ethical question. What kind of society are we when we don't care about hungry kids? When we think it's okay to have breakfast clubs and charities to provide the basics? When the state says it isn't our concern, it's no longer our worry. So recognising that poverty is the biggest single factor affecting student learning in schools, my question really to the panel is, if you're a member of the next government, what would you do to keep the promise alive for the most vulnerable children living in poverty in New Zealand? If we move to looking at the factors in the classroom which impact on student learning, what we've tended to fall into is a debate of quality versus quantity. And it's certainly how the media and the Prime Minister have attempted to frame this over the last couple of months. Yet those of us in education know it's far more complicated than that. It's not either quality or quantity. The evidence suggests, of course, it's both. But let's look carefully at what we mean when we talk about quality. The research doesn't actually say that the biggest single factor in classrooms impacting on student achievement is teacher quality. What it says is the quality of the relationship between the teacher and the student. That's the single biggest factor. Not whether or not you've got the flash technical bits of being a teacher, it's about the way in which you create relationships with children in your classroom. And it's why the Prime Minister was right when he was questioned about the quantity-quality debate, when he said people don't remember the size of the classroom, they remember the teacher who made the difference. And of course what they remember is not what that teacher taught. Very little of us remember that. But instead we remember the teacher who knew us, cared about us as human beings, encouraged us, accepted us when we didn't achieve. And guess what? That's easier to achieve in smaller classrooms. And it's vital for children not succeeding that that group of children have smaller classrooms, because that's where more human, personal relationships can be created. And that's where the biggest difference can be made with that group of children. And so I'm left wondering when I think of how does the IES scheme work, when it's teachers who are deemed to be quality teachers, so they have quality relationships with their children, are pulled out of school 2 days of the week. So my question to the panel is, what in-class changes will you enact in the next 3 years to keep the promise alive? But perhaps one of the biggest contention for those in the primary sector is the place of assessment and national standards. Do national standards keep the promise alive? Or are they slowly strangling hope in the classrooms around the country? International evidence is clear. Measuring and testing does not improve student success. It really doesn't matter how many times you get your measuring stick out, it doesn't change how fast things grow. The evidence suggests a regime of constant testing means kids get better at the test. But that doesn't mean they get better at learning. National standards, of course, have a range of unintended consequences. We know from international and national evidence that national standards impact on the culture of schools. Schools under a constant regime of testing become less creative, less critical, narrower, more factory-like. There is a loss of discipline knowledge, including science, history, geography, the arts. They all disappear. A broad curriculum goes, and with a sense that schools are more than places where we test kids on how well they can read and write. No one argues that literacy and numeracy aren't important and vital, but they aren't all that schools do. Of course, national standards don't measure the wider promise of schools, for schools serve a multitude of social and personal purposes. They are the rocks and refuges for communities when disasters strike. We know this about many of the schools that did this in Christchurch and are now closed. Schools in poor areas are already hubs, places where families congregate to celebrate their communities, create a sense of belonging beyond themselves. How we might measure the value and worth of these things that schools do, rather than simply in what they do for individual achievement, might help to rebalance the sterility of approach to education that pervades language that can only talk about student outcomes. How we might see and begin to value as a national treasure, not purely on the basis of individuals, but on the basis of the strength that it gives us as a democracy. How might we keep the promise of a broad curriculum, of a wider sense of schools might be? How might we balance the drive for increased achievement in literacy and numeracy without losing all that made New Zealand a world leader in education? Education, the great gift, the promise of a better world, is what New Zealanders are asked to consider when they tick for kids when they vote. I look forward, as we all do, to how you, the panel, see that promise might be kept. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou.